So the war in Ukraine is a pretty interesting issue in the context of American politics at the moment because it's something that 10 years ago would not have been a divisive issue. It wouldn't be something that the Democrats and Republicans took sides on or were so opposed over. And I think that's because of a perfect series of circumstances that have unraveled over the last 5 years that have taken Ukraine from something that is very easy to agree upon amongst Americans to something that should inherently be viewed with skepticism. This, like so many other things in American politics at the moment, goes back to 2016 and the election of Donald Trump. One thing you will probably remember is a lot of claims of Russian interference in that election and how Trump responded to those allegations. Trump quite infamously told the Russians to investigate Hillary Clinton and see if they could find her emails that she had deleted. And I believe it's the first time in any political race that a presidential candidate has encouraged a foreign power to investigate and dig up dirt on their political opponent. So when the Russians did do that, and they did find resources that were incriminating to the Democratic Party, a lot of people laid the blame for that, at least in the Democratic side of politics, on Trump himself for his basic inciting of that. So the investigation into Russian collusion after the election and during Trump's term did not find any evidence of President Trump himself interacting with the Russians, but there were some convictions, the most notable being that Paul Manafort, Trump's campaign manager, had been laundering money for a former Ukrainian president who was pro-Putin, a man who fled the country in 2014 and was living within Russia under Putin's protection. So take away from that what you will. But no direct line was established that showed that Donald Trump himself had coordinated with the Russians. And as such, it became sort of an established norm within right-wing politics that Democrats ramble about Russia when they don't have like any valid point to make, as it were. This put Russia in a position of not being a genuine threat or actor, but rather as a lie that Democrats tell people and themselves when they want to attack Trump and his party. So that's kind of the groundwork for it becoming a partisan issue, but things only got worse when Trump's first impeachment hearings began. If you don't remember, Trump was impeached before 2021. He was actually impeached for the first time back in 2019 when allegedly he had been withholding or was threatening to withhold military aid to the Ukrainians unless they were able to find dirt on the Biden family. This was because Joe Biden's family had business connections and deals in Ukraine, and that is a whole different topic for another video, but that was allegedly what Trump wanted information on in exchange for continued support to Zelensky and the Ukrainians. So you can see how the cracks here are beginning to form. Ukraine is now, in some conservative circles, just viewed as a new platform for Democrats to peddle lines about Trump being connected to Russia, and subsequently the Democrats think this is evidence of Trump's corruption and his beneficial attitude towards Russia. So the cracks are really starting to take place in the political norm of how this issue would be handled. So when the war in Ukraine begins, Joe Biden is incredibly unpopular, and the Ukrainian war can kind of be established as a partisan point from then on. The Republicans, not only do they have this context, this background of thinking that the Democrats hyperinflate the threat of Russia and thinking that Ukraine is just a staging ground for their political attacks, they can also see it's a place where now billions of taxpayer dollars are going through military support, and they can attack that from a financial perspective. But I think it's gone further than that, because the MAGA new conservative movement is very isolationist in its foreign relation perspectives. It's much more of a looking inwards at the society as opposed to relations overseas. Particularly being critical of the idea of helping people overseas while people at home are struggling so much, despite the fact that most of that military aid is already assembled weaponry and the value of it, not pure money itself. And this certainly isn't helped by the fact that the Biden family has a history of business ties in Ukraine, so there's a further room for conspiracy and speculation about, oh, this is about Biden's personal interest, this isn't really for the interest of Americans. So what is Trump's plan when he gets into office as to how to approach the Russia-Ukraine war differently? Well, it's a surprise. And I mean, he's literally described it as such. Aside from a vague commitment to stop the war in 24 hours as if that is possible, we don't really have any concrete plans from him. And what I referred to then about the surprise is that he says that he has a plan in place, but he won't announce it until he's in office because he needs it to be a surprise or else those plans will be thwarted. JD Vance has been a bit more clear as to what he thinks the Trump administration's plans are going to be, and they're pretty concerning, I would say. Vance has said that he quite literally couldn't care less about what is happening in Ukraine and what does end up happening there, and it seems that his vague approach is that it shouldn't be viewed as a fight between good and evil, and that it isn't some humanitarian issue of our time. I'm not sure why he's phrased it that way, but it seems that that's sort of an attempt to position himself as above it, as sort of a rational person looking in, implying that the Democrats are wrong to view this as a simple invader versus invaded situation, which is giving the Russians a lot of credit. And JD Vance goes even further to say that he would ideally have a demilitarized zone between Ukraine and Russia along the territory that is currently occupied by the Russians, which I think in reality is going to mean giving them control over that territory and also ensuring that Ukraine is never allowed to join NATO. I think the concern there is that it's too isolationist in its perspective. It's the sense that America will go and make a decision and then leave, despite the fact that probably risks every relationship that the US has with other NATO members. What that would effectively do is send a message to the Russians that the United States does not care if Russia expands its borders militarily within Europe. And I feel like that is essentially telling the Europeans to take care of it themselves, which just seems like a recipe for disaster, because if you're trying to show the Russians that they can't do this, they cannot expand militarily in the manner they have in Ukraine, you cannot reward them with success, partial or otherwise, when they attempt to do so. All that's proven is that the US is not interested in helping with the defense of Europe itself. And I feel like that's going to cause a lot of countries to panic and really reevaluate how they assess their own defense. Because this is not taking a step away from war. This is showing you that war can be successful if you engage in it. And I feel like that's going to embolden the Russians in the decades going forward. Because in that reality, it doesn't become a question of if the Russians will try this again somewhere else, but a question of when they will. And more importantly, where they will. And if you want to know the answer to that question, vote for Donald Trump.